It's clear that after the November election, the state of Idaho and the governor had a choice. We either establish a state-created, market-driven health insurance exchange that meets our needs as best we can, or we surrender our authority on the matter to the feds and accept a federal exchange. To Governor Otter, this is a states' rights issue, and it's through the creation of a state-based exchange that he believes we assert our state sovereignty and that we maintain the decision-making authority for the state and for the individuals within this state over their personal health care issues. Now, turning to the substance of the RS, it's really straightforward. It first sets forth the purpose and intent of the legislature in seeking a state-based exchange. Namely, again, that we are exercising our state sovereignty and maintaining as much decision-making authority as possible. The next section is a brief definitional section that defines some of the frequent terms used in the RS. Following that, there's a section that establishes a state-based health insurance exchange as an independent body corporate in politic to serve as a marketplace to facilitate the voluntary sale and purchase of health insurance and standalone dental plans in the state of Idaho. It's important to point out that the RS specifically states that this entity is not a state agency. The RS creates a board to govern and oversee the exchange, comprised of 16 members. 2 of those are ex officio members, and they are the director of the Department of Insurance and the director of the Department of Health and Welfare. There are 14 voting members on the board. The voting members will be appointed by and serve at the pleasure of the governor. They will also be subject to Senate confirmation. Of the 14 voting members, the RS on page 2, starting at line 39, requires the governor to appoint 3 members representing different health carriers, 2 members representing producers. Both of those terms, health carriers and producers, are defined within the RS. 3 members representing individual consumer interests, and 4 members representing employer business interests, and each of those 4 positions represent a certain type of business, specifically the number of employees. Then, following on the next page, 2 members representing healthcare providers. What's important to point out is that the RS also goes on to state that none of the board members or any person working or performing services for the exchange are state employees. They are not. They are not considered state employees for any purpose. They're not entitled to or eligible for any benefits as under the state plan or policies. It's then also important to point out that the RS establishes the mandatory duties and discretionary authorities of the board and some of the limitations that we feel are important for this type of entity. Looking at the mandatory duties, all the meetings of the board will be subject to the open meeting laws of the state of Idaho. The board will be required to contract for an independent audit on an annual basis. Furthermore, the board will develop and adopt and implement procurement policies and guidelines. And there is a mandatory reporting requirement to both the governor, the director, and the legislature, beginning in January 2014 and every year thereafter. Some of the discretionary functions of the board you'll see on page 3, beginning on line 35. This board is able to perform all the duties necessary and appropriate to implement a health insurance exchange, to adopt bylaws, to assess and collect fees from participating health carriers, exchange users, or participants who receive any funds, and from participants, and it can receive any sort of funds from any process. But it's also important to point out that the RS requires the exchange to be self-sustaining, and it cannot request state funds. when you look at the limitations that the IRS establishes on page 4, starting at line 7, the exchange does not have the ability to alter its own legal structure. It has to be financially self-supporting, as I just mentioned, and it cannot request financial support from the state, nor does it have the power to tax or encumber state assets. The exchange has to be a voluntary marketplace. It cannot preclude providers from selling insurance within that marketplace, as long as they meet the standards of the state of Idaho and the exchange. And I think it's also important to point out that neither the exchange nor any agency of the state of Idaho shall require any person to participate in the exchange, nor shall they have the authority to impose upon or collect from any person any penalty for failure or refusal to participate in the exchange. After that, the IRS goes on to allow the board to rely on the work that has been done by the Department of Insurance, the Department of Health and Welfare. And finally, there's an emergency clause. And with that, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hensley. Other questions from the committee? Senator Durst.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hensley, I just have a couple questions. Actually, more just comments and trying to get some feedback so we have something for the bill hearing itself. It'd be really useful for me to be able to see some comparative analysis done between what this RS and bill will do and that of the federal requirements on a section by section, regulation by regulation basis, so that we can be sure that this state health insurance exchange would be meeting the requirements federally required upon it, so that we don't have any concerns about potential federal overreach on this particular issue. That'd be number one. And my second question would be related to some comparative analysis between this governing board and the governing board of other states that have also opted for a state exchange, so we can kind of get some feelings for what those look like. I'll have more questions later, but those two issues would be helpful to have in advance so we can look at them a little more closely.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Hensley, do you have a comment?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Durst, maybe on your second point, quick comment. It's clear that you have two choices in the state-based exchange. You can have a nonprofit entity, or you can have a quasi-governmental entity like we have decided in terms of the independent body, corporate and politic. In terms of that choice is also informed by the Idaho Constitution. It's informed by the past practices of the legislature, where the legislature has created other entities in a similar vein, like the insurance fund, the high-risk pool, and others. And so we used that information in the formation of the entity that's going to govern and oversee the exchange. And as to the rest, senators are happy to provide that information.
Mr. Chairman, just a point of clarification.
Senator Durst.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hensley, I'm talking specifically about the composition of the board, not the way that it's being put together, but actually the actual composition in terms of the number of providers and that sort of thing. Have that comparison being done between what the other states that are doing health insurance exchange are currently doing.
Mr. Hensley.
If that makes more sense.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Durst, happy to provide that.
Thank you very much. Other questions from the committee for Mr. Hensley?